All right, so now that we've spent some time suffering through the preferences and getting a little bit familiar with the Ableton Live layout, I think it's time to start making some music. So attached to this video lecture in the resources section, you can actually find a sample pack that I made specifically for this course. So I'm gonna go ahead and add that folder to my Ableton Live browser. So we've gone ahead and added it, and you can see we have a few different drum hits. Now feel free to use these files or your own files. It really doesn't matter. Just be sure you're following along and making your own drum loop. So now that we have access to these samples, we can actually go ahead and drag them directly from the browser onto any audio clip and even create new audio clips. Now, right now, we're currently working on a grid in the arrangement view. If we were to hit tab, you'll see we're moving on to the session view here. Now the session view is a completely and entirely different workstation from the arrangement view. So we'll be coming back to the session view. This is where we launch clips and kind of do live performances and things like that. There's a whole lot of creative options here in the session view, but for now we're going to be focusing in on the arrangement view, where we have a traditional timeline and a grid where we can arrange clips as we see fit. So speaking of the grid, before we start laying these clips out, let's actually talk about the different grid settings. So here you can see we have adaptive grid settings and fixed grid settings. Now you can either run an adaptive grid or a fixed grid. I personally like to run the adaptive grid because adaptive grid means that as I zoom in or out, I'm going to get more subdivisions and it's just going to adapt to my view. Now fixed grid, on the other hand, is just going to allow you to select one subdivision, say one bar, and even as we zoom in or out, it's still only going to show you that one bar. So I definitely think that adaptive grid works the best, and I find that narrow works for me. So now let's actually import the clips. I'm going to go ahead and clear out the arrangement view, and we're going to come back into the browser, select everything, and click and drag. Now by default they want to go on the same track, but we want them all on their separate tracks so that we get mixing independence. So I'm going to hold the Control on Windows or Command on a Mac, and that's going to separate these clips into their own tracks. So because we had them named properly, we can now see that we have a triangle perk, we have a snare, a kick, an open hi-hat, a closed hi-hat, and a percussion bongo sound. Now when editing clips in the arrangement view, we actually have quite a few options. The most basic being Control-C and Control-V to copy and paste. That's going to be Command-C and Command-V if you're running on Mac. And we can also drag duplicates holding the Control on Windows or Alt key on a Mac and clicking and dragging. And that's going to create a duplicate without having to press Control-C, Control-V. Additionally, we can use the duplicate function to duplicate clips, and that's just going to be Control-D or Command-D. If you want to delete clips, you can make a selection and press the backspace key to clear them from the arrangement. In addition to duplicating and deleting clips, we can also split clips using Control or Command-E, and that will just split based on where our insert marker is. Let's go ahead and undo that. Now, there are quite a few more options for editing in the arrangement view, but for now, these basic edits will get you by for creating our simple drum loop. Now, one important distinction to make is your selections. Oftentimes, we can select more or less than what we bargained for. So as you can see here, before the bongo perk sound, we have a little bit of time selected, and after the bongo perk clip, we also have more time selected. So if I were to press Control-C, come over here, I'm expecting this clip to be laid perfectly at 2.2. I press Control-V and it's offset a little bit. So it's important to understand that if you're selecting time along with a clip, then that time is also going to be copied. So now I have just the clip selected, and I'm going to come back to 2.2, and it works exactly how I expected. An easy way to see what you have selected would be to look to the triangles. So at the top of the grid and at the bottom of the grid, you can see we have these triangles indicating what selection we have made. Right now you can see we've only selected time. Here, if we select a clip, it will show us how long that clip selection actually is. So always pay attention to the triangles and know what you are selecting. Now, one more thing I forgot to mention is actually temporarily disabling the grid. So if we go to click and drag this clip, you can see that it's snapping to the grid, but we can temporarily disable the grid holding Alt on PC or Command on Windows. And that will allow us to place clips off of the grid. Just remember that if you try to select that clip, oftentimes you're going to be selecting the time as well. And maybe you want that. So just make sure that if you want to select the time, you are selecting the time. If you don't, then you're only selecting the clip. It really depends on where you want to lay the clips down. So now that we've showed you some basic clip editing, let's go ahead and start laying out these clips. First things first, I'm just going to make a 2-bar loop. So I am going to highlight the end of 2 bars, press Control L, Command L on a Mac, and that's going to create a loop for us so that we can continue to work on this without having to constantly press stop and play. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the kick and snare pattern. I'll solo these tracks and start laying them out. Typically you want the kicks on the 1 and the 2, and then we're going to put the snares probably somewhere right here. Let's see if this sounds good for our tempo. Right now we have 90 beats per minute. Feel free to pick whatever tempo you like. I personally like to work at 90 BPM a lot of the time. Okay, so that's running well. Let's go ahead and highlight the snares again, duplicate that plus the time over so that we get a constant snare pattern. And I think I actually want to do a little bit of a stutter kick, so I'm going to duplicate this kick. All right, and this is quickly starting to turn into something. Let's go ahead and add these hi-hats in. And we just want a slow pattern, maybe 1/8 notes. It sounds a little fast, but we'll keep it for now and duplicate this across. All right, so I'm going to keep on incorporating sounds and using the edits that we've gone over to create our drum loop, and I'll come back when I have something that we can work with. Okay, so I finished arranging up my loop, and this is what I've come up with so far. And just to make it slightly more interesting, I'm going to do a bit of panning, and you can see I've already adjusted some volumes here. Here we have kind of a little mixer layout in the arrangement view. We have the volume available to us, and we have some panning options. So I'm going to go ahead and pan these closed hi-hats a little bit to the left, pan the open hi-hat a little bit to the right to create some separation, and then I'm going to mess around with these perks. I think I want the triangle on the right hand side and the bongo a little bit on the left hand side, and that's just going to spread things out a little bit and make it just a tad bit more interesting. I'm going to bring this triangle down a little bit. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with how that came out. I think this is going to be a nice foundation for the track that we're building. Alright, so let's go ahead and save this drum loop so that we can continue working on it in the next video. I'm going to hit Control S, that's going to be Command S if you're on a Windows, and I'm going to navigate to my desktop and save it in a brand new place. Let's call this Practical Live 11. And so now we should have our set saved inside of a project. If you remember from the last video, I told you that Ableton Live sets have to be saved in a project. And if you don't save one in a project like we just did, then a project will be automatically created. So let's go ahead and close down Ableton and check out the project that we're going to be working with. Here we have the Practical Live 11 project. And if I open that up, you can see here's my Ableton Live set, and then we have a project with what seems to be some Ableton project info. So in the next video, we will be diving into Ableton Live's file manager and learning a bit more about how sets and projects actually work.